Hey guys, tonight we begin with a family so spectacularly dysfunctional that they somehow managed to make the Habsburgs, yes, the very same Habsburgs who married their own cousins until their jaws stopped closing and their DNA filed a formal complaint, look like a calm and well-adjusted little book club. Tonight we're talking about the Spanish Bourbons, the dynasty that took over an entire empire and immediately began treating it like a group project where nobody wanted to do the work. We have got depressed kings who refused to get out of bed for months, a monarch soothed to sleep every single night by the same castrato singer for a solid decade, a queen who ran the whole country while her husband tinkered with clocks in the next room, and a king so treacherous his own subjects gave him a nickname that translates to roughly the worst man we have ever met. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are what keep this whole strange little corner of history alive, and I read every single one. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. The channel is also now on Spotify if you would rather listen with your eyes closed, and the link for that is sitting quietly in the description whenever you want it. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what actually happens when you hand a sprawling global empire to a homesick teenager who would rather be back home in France? Have you wondered what a royal court does when the king refuses to shave, refuses to dress, and starts singing opera at 3 a.m. to nobody in particular? What do you do when your monarch is more interested in repairing pocket watches than repairing his kingdom? And could an entire nation really be run for years by a former palace bodyguard who happened to be extremely popular with the Queen? Congratulations, you've just woken up in the Spanish royal court. The year is 1700, the last Habsburg king has just died without an heir, and a nervous French teenager is about to inherit a crumbling empire he never asked for. Good luck. Here are segments 1 through 2. Before the Bourbons ever set foot in Spain, there was a problem, and that problem was named Charles II, the final Habsburg king, a man so ravaged by generations of royal inbreeding that historians simply call him the Bewitched. He could barely chew, barely walk, and could not produce an heir if his life depended on it, which, dynastically speaking, it did. When he died in 1700 without a single child, he left behind a will that handed the entire Spanish Empire to a French prince, and in doing so, he lit a fuse under all of Europe. Every major power suddenly wanted a say in who got Spain, and none of them were feeling especially polite about it. The stage was set for chaos, war, and a brand new family of monarchs who would spend the next 3 centuries proving that things could, in fact, get weirder. And the man at the centre of it all had not even arrived yet. To understand just how tangled this knot had become, you have to understand poor Charles himself, a king assembled almost entirely from the accumulated bad decisions of his ancestors. His family had spent generations marrying uncles to nieces and cousins to cousins in the belief that keeping the bloodline pure would keep the empire strong. The result was the opposite. His jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth could not meet, which made eating a slow and difficult ordeal, and he was frequently unwell in ways nobody at the time could name or treat. His court, being deeply superstitious, concluded that so unfortunate a king must be the victim of witchcraft, hence the nickname, and they subjected him to exorcisms in the genuine hope of fixing a problem that was written into his very cells. It is a bit like trying to reboot a computer by shouting at it, except the computer was a monarch and the stakes were an empire spanning several continents. The tragedy of Charles was that everyone spent his entire reign waiting for him to die, and he obliged them only after decades of frail, painful survival. The real fight was over what came next. With no child to inherit, The great houses of Europe circled the Spanish throne like relatives reading a wealthy uncle's will while he was still technically breathing. France pushed for a French heir, Austria pushed for an Austrian one, and everyone else scrambled to make sure no single power swallowed Spain whole and became unstoppable. On his deathbed, pressured from all sides and desperate to keep his empire in one piece, Charles signed the document that named a grandson of the French king as his successor, effectively choosing France over his own Austrian relatives. The moment the ink dried and the old king finally passed, the fuse he had lit began to burn. Austria refused to accept the decision, alliances hardened, and within a couple of years the continent slid into the long and bloody War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict fought across Europe over the simple question of who got to sit in a chair in Madrid. An empire had changed hands not through conquest or triumph, but through the last wish of a dying, exhausted man. And somewhere far to the north, in the golden halls of Versailles, the teenager about to inherit all of this uncertainty was being told to pack his bags. The lucky, or deeply unlucky heir was Philip, grandson of Louis XIV, the legendary Sun King of France. At just 17 years old, Philip was plucked out of the glittering comfort of Versailles and shipped south to rule a foreign country he had never seen, whose language he did not speak, and whose people were not entirely convinced they wanted him. Imagine being a teenager freshly graduated, and instead of a gap year you're handed an empire that spans several continents and comes with a war attached. Philip arrived pale, overwhelmed, and profoundly homesick, and he would remain homesick for the rest of his life. He missed France, he missed his grandfather, and he missed the version of his future where he was not personally responsible for millions of strangers. But the crown was his now, and with it came a darkness that would define his entire reign. He had not been raised to expect any of this. As a younger grandson of the French king, Philip had grown up in the comfortable knowledge that someone else would do the ruling, which is a very relaxing way to grow up. He was quiet, devout, and a touch withdrawn, the sort of young man who was perfectly content to let the world happen around him. Then the Spanish will arrived. His grandfather saw a golden opportunity to place a French prince on a foreign throne, and Philip's peaceful obscurity evaporated in an afternoon. One day he was a spare, the next he was a king, and nobody thought to ask whether he actually wanted the job. The journey south only deepened his gloom. Spain in that era was a proud, ceremonious, deeply formal place, and its court operated by rigid traditions that felt utterly alien to a boy raised in the comparatively theatrical splendour of Versailles. The food was different, the etiquette was different, the whole rhythm of the day was different, and everywhere he turned there were advisors, factions and grandees quietly sizing him up to see how easily he could be managed. Some of his new subjects welcomed him. Others openly preferred the Austrian candidate and regarded their French king as an unwelcome import. It is difficult to feel at home when a meaningful slice of the population is actively hoping you lose the war being fought over your existence. And that war followed him everywhere. Barely settled into his new palaces, Philip found himself the human centerpiece of an international conflict. His legitimacy questioned by rival monarchs, his territories fought over by professional armies, his reign a matter of open dispute for years. He did show flashes of genuine resolve, riding out on campaign and taking his duties seriously when his health allowed it. But the loneliness never lifted. He clung to routine, to religion, and above all to the women he married, needing constant companionship the way other people need air, because being alone with his own thoughts was a place he could not bear to visit. What nobody around him fully understood, at least not in the language they had for it then, was that Philip carried something heavier than homesickness. Beneath the shyness and the longing for France lay a mind that would, again and again, pull him down into a darkness he could not climb out of on his own. The empire had gained a king. It had also gained a deeply fragile man, and before long, that fragility would begin to shape the destiny of the entire Spanish crown, starting with the nights he simply could not face the morning. Philip V had a secret, and that secret was a crushing, relentless depression that would today likely be diagnosed as something serious and treatable. Back then, it was simply called melancholy, and the treatment was mostly to hope it went away. It did not. Philip would sink into episodes so severe that he refused to leave his bed for weeks at a time, sometimes months. He would not change his clothes. He would not cut his hair or his nails. He became convinced at various points that he was gravely ill or dying, or in some accounts that he was not entirely human anymore. The most powerful man in the Spanish Empire spent enormous stretches of his life as a shivering shape under the blankets, and somebody had to actually run the country while he did it. That somebody was about to arrive, and she did not intend to ask permission. It is worth pausing here, because it would be easy to treat this as just another royal eccentricity, and it was not. What Philip endured was real suffering, the kind that would have been agonizing in any century, made worse by living in one that had no medicine for it and no words of comfort beyond prayer. His illness came in waves. There were long stretches where he functioned, attended to duties, and behaved much like any anxious, dutiful monarch. Then the tide would go out, and he would vanish into himself, unable to rise, unable to be seen, unable to believe he was anything but doomed. During his worst periods, the practical machinery of kingship simply had to carry on without him. Documents piled up, ministers waited. Foreign ambassadors, accustomed to being received with pomp, found themselves quietly informed that His Majesty was indisposed, which was a diplomatic way of saying the king could not be persuaded to get dressed. His physicians, armed with the best ideas of their age, tried the usual remedies of the time, none of which addressed the actual problem, because the actual problem was not something a poultice could reach. They could no more cure his mind than they could have cured his Habsburg predecessor's jaw. His condition also warped the schedule of the entire court. In his darker years, Philip increasingly lived by night and slept through the day, so that meetings, meals, and even affairs of state drifted into the small hours. A whole royal household reorganized itself around the rhythms of one exhausted man, tiptoeing through daylight so the king could rest, then coming alive at hours when most of Europe was asleep. It gave the palace a strange, hushed, upside-down quality. A kingdom governed in candlelight by a ruler who could not always tell whether he was well. Through all of it, Philip remained king, and that is the quiet tragedy of the story. He never abandoned his faith or his sense of duty, and in his clearer moments he genuinely tried. But the weight of an empire is a heavy thing to carry even for the strong, and Philip was fighting a private battle that left him very little strength to spare. What he needed was someone forceful enough to hold the kingdom steady while he was lost to it, someone who could manage not just the paperwork, but the man himself. He would find exactly that person in his second wife, a woman who took one look at the situation and recognized it, correctly, as an opportunity. When Philip's first wife died, he remarried with almost indecent speed, because he could not stand to be alone for even a moment. His new bride was Elizabeth Farnese, an ambitious Italian noblewoman who took one look at her fragile, weeping husband and realized something extraordinary. Whoever controlled Philip controlled Spain, and she intended to control Philip completely. She managed his moods, his schedule, his fears, and his kingdom, steering the empire's foreign policy towards securing thrones for her own children. She was fiercely intelligent, endlessly patient, and absolutely relentless. The true power behind a man who could barely lift his head off the pillow. But even Elizabeth, for all her cleverness, could not soothe her husband's darkest nights alone. For that, she would need help from the most unexpected source imaginable. Their marriage began with a small palace revolution. When Elizabeth arrived, there was already a powerful woman managing the king's household, a formidable princess who had grown used to running things. Elizabeth, sensing a rival, moved with startling swiftness and had her removed almost immediately, making it clear from day one that there would be exactly one queen in this arrangement, and it would be her. It was less a royal welcome and more a corporate takeover, executed by someone who had clearly read the entire situation before she even unpacked. From there she made herself utterly indispensable, which was not difficult given her husband's condition. Philip's emotional dependence on his wife was total, and Elizabeth understood that his need for constant companionship was also the source of her authority. She was rarely apart from him. She soothed his terrors, structured his days, decided who reached him and who did not, and in doing so quietly gathered the reins of government into her own hands. Ministers who wanted the king's ear soon learned they first had to have the queen's approval, because the surest route to the throne ran directly through her. Her ambitions, however, reached well beyond Madrid. Elizabeth had children of her own, and because Philip already had sons from his first marriage, who stood ahead of them in the Spanish succession, she set her sights on securing crowns for her boys elsewhere. Much of Spanish foreign policy during these years was shaped by this single maternal mission, a determined campaign to win Italian territories and titles for her sons. She pushed for wars, alliances, and diplomatic maneuvers with the focus of a woman playing a very long game, and remarkably over time, she largely got what she wanted. It was one of the more successful examples in history of a mother rearranging the map of Europe to make sure her children were provided for. To her critics, she was scheming and domineering, a foreign queen bending an entire empire toward the interests of her own family. To a more sympathetic eye, she was a capable ruler doing the actual work of government, while her husband was incapacitated, holding a fragile monarchy together through sheer will. Both things can be true at once, and in Elizabeth's case they were. She was the steadying hand and the ambitious operator, the nurse and the strategist, all in one relentless package. But there were limits even to Elizabeth's considerable talents. She could manage the kingdom and manage the king by day, yet the nights belonged to Philip's private darkness, and no amount of political skill could talk a man out of despair at 3 a.m. Something else was needed, something stranger, a remedy nobody could have predicted. And so the Queen sent for a voice, one that had already made grown audiences weep across the great theatres of Europe. The solution to the king's midnight despair arrived in the form of Farinelli, the most famous castrato singer in all of Europe, a voice so celebrated that audiences reportedly fainted at his performances. Elizabeth brought him to court with one job, and it was possibly the strangest job description in royal history. Every single night, Farinelli was to sing to the king to calm him, and so he did, performing the same small handful of songs over and over night after night for around a decade. The most acclaimed singer of his generation essentially became a full-time, extremely expensive human lullaby for one deeply troubled man. He was paid a fortune, given a life of comfort, and asked never to sing anywhere else. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it worked, and it kept a fragile king functioning just enough to hold an empire together. Farinelli was, at the time, roughly the equivalent of a global superstar, the kind of performer whose arrival in a city was an event, and whose voice was described in near-religious terms. He had spent years dazzling the opera houses of Italy and London, commanding enormous fees and adoration wherever he went. So when he agreed to enter the private service of the Spanish crown and effectively retire from public performance, it was as if the most famous voice in the world had simply switched itself off for everyone except one audience of one. The arrangement was the Queen's idea, and it was a stroke of intuitive genius. Where doctors and remedies had failed, music reached something in Philip that nothing else could touch. On his difficult nights, when the darkness pressed in and sleep would not come, Farinelli would sing, and the king would be soothed, calmed, sometimes moved to tears, sometimes finally able to rest. It was not a cure, because there was no cure, but it was relief, and relief was precious. A voice became the most reliable medicine in the entire royal pharmacy. What makes the story linger is the repetition. By many accounts, Farinelli sang the same few pieces to the king again and again, essentially the same short set list, for years on end. Picture the finest singer of the age, capable of the most dazzling music imaginable, reduced to performing the identical handful of gentle songs every night to help one man get through until morning. There is something both faintly comic and quietly tender about it. A superstar spending the peak of his career as a lullaby machine, and doing it faithfully, without complaint, because it genuinely helped. He was rewarded lavishly for it, of course. Farinelli was showered with wealth, given a comfortable and privileged position at court, and treated as a valued and trusted figure rather than a mere entertainer. He grew close to the royal family and remained in Spanish service for a long stretch of years, well beyond Philip's own life, becoming a fixture of the court and even wielding a degree of quiet influence. Not bad for a man whose official duty was at its heart to hum a king to sleep. The whole episode is one of the strangest footnotes in royal history, and also one of the most humane. Stripped of the absurdity, it is simply the story of a suffering man, a resourceful wife, and a kind voice that made the nights bearable. It could not last forever, though. Philip's exhaustion with his own existence was mounting, and eventually he would try to escape the crown entirely, in a dramatic gesture that seemed, at last, like the peace he had always wanted. It would not go remotely as planned. In 1724, Philip decided he had finally had enough. Exhausted by his own mind and desperate for peace, he shocked everyone by abdicating the throne, handing the crown to his teenage son, and announcing that he would retire to a quiet life of prayer and rest. It was, on paper, a touching act of self-awareness from a man who knew he was not well. There was just one small problem with this beautiful plan. His young successor was about to run into an obstacle far more permanent than any political crisis, and Philip's peaceful retirement was going to be one of the shortest in the history of European royalty. The decision at the time seemed almost noble. Here was a king who understood on some level that his illness made him unfit to carry the burden he'd been handed, and who chose to step aside rather than cling to power he could barely wield. He spoke of wanting to devote himself to God, to prepare his soul, to trade the crushing responsibility of empire for the calm of a religious retreat. For a man who had spent decades drowning under the weight of the throne, abdication looked like a lifeboat. There were quieter theories about his motives as well. Some at the time whispered that Philip had not entirely given up on grandeur, and that a tempting possibility hovered in the background involving the throne of his native France, which was being held by a very young and not especially healthy king. By stepping down in Spain, the reasoning went, Philip might keep himself available should the French crown ever come open, since holding two great thrones at once was politically impossible. Whether ambition, exhaustion, faith, or some tangle of all three drove him, the outcome was the same. He laid down the Spanish crown and retreated with Elizabeth to a life away from the daily grind of government. For a brief, strange interval, Spain had a new young king and a semi-retired old one living quietly nearby, which is an awkward arrangement under the best of circumstances. A former monarch does not simply stop being a former monarch, and Philip's presence loomed over his son's fresh reign even from a distance. The court now had to navigate the delicate question of how much the retired king should be consulted, how much authority truly rested with the new one, and what exactly the old king was supposed to do with himself all day. That question, as it turned out, would be answered by tragedy rather than politics. Philip's grand plan for a serene and prayerful retirement rested entirely on the assumption that his son would live to rule, freeing him to fade gently into the background. It was a reasonable assumption. The boy was young, the succession was settled, and for once the family's path forward looked clear and uncomplicated. Philip had at long last engineered his escape. But the 18th century was no respecter of reasonable assumptions, and disease in particular cared nothing for royal plans. Within months, the tidy arrangement Philip had built would collapse in the most painful way possible, dragging him back toward the very burden he had so gratefully set down. His peaceful exit was about to become a cruel detour, and the crown he thought he had escaped was preparing to land right back in his reluctant hands. It all hinged on his son, the fresh young king whose reign had barely begun. The teenage son who inherited the throne became Louis I, and for a brief moment Spain had a fresh, young, promising king. That moment lasted roughly 7 months. Louis was around 17 years old when he caught smallpox, and in an era with no vaccines and no meaningful treatment, the disease did what it always did. He died within days, leaving Spain with a dead king, no direct heir, and a retired father sitting in a monastery who had very publicly sworn off ruling forever. Someone was going to have to take the crown back, and everyone knew exactly who that someone would be, even if he was the last person on earth who wanted the job. Louis had come to the throne carrying the hopes of a dynasty that badly needed something to go right. He was young, he was healthy, and he represented a fresh start after his father's long and troubled reign. There was a genuine sense of optimism, the feeling that the crown had passed to a new generation that might rule without the shadows that had haunted the old king. For a few short months, Spain allowed itself to imagine a calmer future. His brief reign was not without its own small dramas, chiefly involving his young wife, whose behaviour at court reportedly caused him no end of embarrassment and strife. The pairing was not a happy one, and the palace buzzed with the ordinary friction of a teenage king trying to manage an unpredictable teenage queen. It was the sort of domestic turbulence that, under normal circumstances, would have been smoothed over with time as both of them grew into their roles. They were, after all, barely more than children playing the parts of monarchs. But there would be no time to grow into anything. Smallpox was one of the great killers of the age, indifferent to rank, sparing neither peasant nor prince, and when it reached the young king it moved with terrible speed. The court could do little but watch and pray as the illness ran its course. Within a matter of days, the promising new reign that had barely begun was simply over, and the optimism that had greeted his accession curdled into shock and grief. A kingdom that had just celebrated a new beginning found itself instead arranging a funeral for a boy. His death left behind a genuine crisis, and not merely an emotional one. Louis had no surviving child to inherit, which meant the direct line of succession had abruptly hit a wall. The throne was suddenly empty, the government was leaderless, and the obvious solution was standing awkwardly in the wings, having spent the past several months insisting to everyone who would listen that he was finished with ruling forever. Philip had abdicated with great ceremony and solemn vows. Now the crown was orphaned, and the only clear candidate to take it up again was the very man who had so desperately laid it down. The situation was cruel in its symmetry. Philip had escaped the throne precisely because his son could carry it, and now his son was gone. Every argument for his retirement had rested on a boy who no longer drew breath. There were murmured debates about whether a man who had formally renounced the crown could even take it back, whether his abdication had been permanent, whether some other arrangement might be found. But the practical reality overwhelmed the legal niceties. Spain needed a king it already had, sitting in seclusion, dreading the summons, and the summons inevitably came. Philip V was dragged, spiritually kicking and screaming, back onto the throne he had so gratefully abandoned. The peace he had craved evaporated overnight, replaced once again by the crushing weight of an empire and the return of his relentless melancholy. He would rule for more than 20 additional years, but they were strange, shadowed years, marked by nocturnal living, deep confusion, and a king who increasingly seemed to exist on a different schedule from the rest of the world. He slept through the day and governed at night, if he governed at all. By the time he finally died, Spain had grown used to being led by a ghost, and the son who inherited next would prove that the family's troubled mind was very much a family trait. The return was agonizing for him. Philip had genuinely believed he was done, that he had traded the throne for the quiet of prayer and rest, and to be pulled back into the very burden that had nearly destroyed him must have felt like a sentence rather than an honour. He resisted the idea at first, reportedly reluctant to break the solemn vows he'd made when he stepped down, and it took real pressure from those around him to convince him that duty left him no choice. In the end, he accepted the crown again, but he accepted it the way a person accepts bad news, without joy. The years that followed had a peculiar dreamlike quality. Philip's illness never truly left him, and his second stretch on the throne saw his eccentricities deepen. His inverted schedule became more entrenched, so that the ordinary business of a great monarchy was increasingly conducted in the dead of night while the rest of the world slept. Ambassadors and ministers adjusted as best they could to a king who might summon them at hours when candles were the only light, and who could drift between lucidity and distress. It gave his court the atmosphere of a place slightly out of step with time itself, yet it would be a mistake to imagine these were empty years for Spain. Behind the strange schedule and the troubled king, the machinery of government kept turning, guided largely by the ever-present Elizabeth and by capable ministers who handled the practical work of running an empire. There were genuine efforts at reform and rebuilding during this period, a slow strengthening of the state that would benefit later reigns. The kingdom did not simply drift. It was steadied by others while its monarch battled a mind that gave him little rest. A strange arrangement that nonetheless held together far longer than anyone might have expected. Still, the human cost was plain to those closest to him. This was a man visibly worn down, ruling not out of ambition but out of obligation, carrying a weight he had begged to be released from. His faith remained his anchor, his wife remained his manager and his comfort, and music remained his refuge. But the underlying suffering was always there, waiting for the next dark tide. He endured it for more than 2 decades, which is its own quiet testament to a stubborn sense of duty in a man who would have preferred, above all things, to be left alone. When death finally came for Philip, it arrived suddenly, and by then the kingdom had long since adapted to the reality of being governed by a fragile and half-hidden king. The throne now passed to one of his sons, and with it, unfortunately, passed something else. For the shadow that had darkened Philip's life was not merely his own misfortune. It ran in the blood, and it was waiting patiently for the next heir to sit down beneath the crown. The next king was Ferdinand VI, another of Philip's sons, and for a while he seemed like a welcome change. Gentle, peace-loving, and genuinely devoted to his wife. Spain even enjoyed a rare stretch of calm and prosperity under his early rule, but lurking beneath the surface was the same darkness that had haunted his father, waiting for its moment. Ferdinand had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited the family's fragile mind, and all it would take was one great loss to bring the whole thing crashing down. That loss, when it came, would be devastating, and it would send the king spiralling into a decline so severe it was painful for the entire court to witness. For a good while, though, Ferdinand looked like the answer to the dynasty's prayers. Where his father had been consumed by turmoil and driven by an ambitious foreign queen with designs across the map, Ferdinand was mild, cautious, and instinctively drawn to peace. He had little appetite for the endless wars that had defined earlier reigns, and he steered Spain deliberately toward calm, keeping the country out of foreign conflicts and focusing instead on strengthening it from within. After decades of drama, the kingdom exhaled. His reign became known for sensible, steady improvement. Ferdinand surrounded himself with talented and reform-minded ministers, and together they worked to modernize the navy, improve the finances, encourage the arts and sciences, and generally tend to the health of the realm rather than fling it into battle. It was an unglamorous kind of good government, the sort that does not produce thrilling legends, but does produce a happier and more stable country. For an ordinary Spaniard, living under a king who preferred building to fighting was a considerable improvement over the alternative. At the heart of Ferdinand's contentment was his marriage. He was deeply, unusually devoted to his wife, Barbara of Portugal, and the two of them shared a genuine bond built on real affection and a mutual love of music. Barbara was intelligent and accomplished, a gifted musician in her own right, and she was far more than a decorative consort. She was Ferdinand's companion, his confidant, and his emotional foundation, the steady presence that kept his inherited fragility at bay. As long as she was beside him, the darkness in his blood stayed quiet, held back by the simple fact of a happy marriage. But that same devotion was also his great vulnerability, and here the family pattern begins to show through the calm. Ferdinand's stability was not the sturdy kind that comes from within. It was propped up almost entirely by one relationship, resting on the presence of a single person. He was, beneath the gentle and prosperous exterior, a man walking a narrow ledge, kept steady only by the hand he held. It was a beautiful thing while it lasted, and also a precarious one, because any structure that depends on a single support is only ever one loss away from collapse. The shadow of Philip hung over all of it. The same illness that had trapped the father in his bed and turned his nights into torment was present in the son, merely dormant, waiting for a reason to wake. Ferdinand's good years were real, and so was the good he did for Spain, but they were lived on borrowed time. Everything depended on Barbara, and Barbara, like all people, was mortal. When she was taken from him, the careful balance of his mind and his reign would shatter almost at once, and the gentle, prosperous king would begin one of the most heartbreaking declines the Spanish court had ever seen. Ferdinand VI adored his wife, Barbara of Portugal, with a devotion that was rare among royal marriages of the age. She was his anchor, his comfort, and the one steady thing in his life. When she died in 1758, Ferdinand simply came undone. He stopped eating properly, refused to be shaved or cared for, and wandered the palace in a state of wild grief and confusion, sometimes trying to harm himself. The gentle, prosperous king dissolved into a ghost within his own home, and within a year he too was dead, leaving no children behind. The crown now passed sideways to a half-brother who was, remarkably, the most stable and competent Bourbon Spain had seen yet, which, given everything so far, is not the highest bar in history. Her death broke something in him that could not be repaired. The bond that had kept his inherited fragility in check was suddenly gone, and without it the darkness that had waited so patiently in his blood came flooding in. Grief of this depth would be crushing for anyone. but for a man carrying the family's vulnerability, it was catastrophic. The steady, sensible king who had guided Spain through years of peace vanished almost overnight, replaced by a figure lost in sorrow and no longer able to care for himself. The final year of his life was a slow and painful withdrawal from the world, and it is a part of the story that deserves gentleness rather than jokes. Ferdinand retreated from public life almost entirely, secluding himself away from the court and the duties that had once defined him. Those around him could only watch, largely helpless, as their king declined. The ordinary business of government drifted, because the man at its centre was in no condition to attend to it, consumed instead by a mourning he could not move through. His ministers and household did what they could, but the medicine of the age had no answer for a broken heart any more than it had for his father's melancholy. They tried to keep him comfortable, to maintain some order, to protect him from himself in his most distressed moments. It was a quiet, sad vigil, a court holding its breath around a king who was slipping further away each week. There was no dramatic downfall here, no rebellion or intrigue, only the simple and profound tragedy of a devoted man who could not survive the loss of the person he loved. Within about a year of Barbara's death, Ferdinand followed her. He died having produced no children, which meant that once again the direct line had reached a dead end, and the crown would have to move sideways rather than straight down. It was a mournful close to a reign that had begun with such promise, and had genuinely done Spain a great deal of good. For all his fragility, Ferdinand had been a kind and constructive king, and his story is less a comedy of royal dysfunction than a reminder that even crowns cannot shield a person from grief. And so the throne passed to his half-brother, a son of Philip V and the formidable Elizabeth Farnese, a man who had already spent years ruling elsewhere and had built a reputation as capable, energetic, and refreshingly sane. After a father lost to melancholy and a brother lost to sorrow, Spain was about to receive something it had not enjoyed in a very long time, a monarch in full possession of his faculties who actually wanted to do the job. His rival marks a genuine turning point in the family's fortunes, though. This being the Bourbons, even the sensible one would arrive with a few splendidly strange habits of his own. Charles III took the throne in 1759 and immediately did something the family was not famous for. He got to work. Widely remembered as an enlightened despot, Charles was a genuinely capable ruler who modernized cities, encouraged science, reformed the economy, and generally behaved like an adult with a to-do list. He's often considered the best king the Spanish Bourbons ever produced, which is a bit like being voted most responsible pirate, but credit where it is due. He truly cared about improving his kingdom. Of course, this being the Bourbons, even the competent one had his quirks, and Charles came with a set of personal obsessions that range from the practical to the completely bizarre. He did not arrive as a beginner, which helps explain the difference. Before Spain, Charles had already spent years ruling in Italy, cutting his teeth on the actual practice of governing, making real decisions, and learning what worked and what did not. He came to Madrid as a seasoned monarch rather than a nervous heir, bringing with him a clear philosophy and a habit of surrounding himself with intelligent, reform-minded ministers rather than flatterers. It was the difference between hiring someone with decades of experience and handing the keys to a homesick teenager, and Spain felt that difference almost immediately. His reforms touched nearly every corner of the kingdom. He worked to modernize the economy, encourage trade and industry, and loosen the grip of old restrictions that had been strangling growth. He promoted science and learning, founded institutions, sponsored expeditions, and tried to drag Spain into step with the enlightened thinking sweeping across Europe. He even took on entrenched powers within his own realm when he believed they were obstructing progress, a genuinely bold move for any monarch of the age. He governed, in short, like a man who had read the job description and intended to fulfill it. But he was still a Bourbon, and the family could not produce a king entirely free of eccentricity. In Charles, the strangeness took the form of obsession, and his great obsession was hunting. He pursued it with a devotion that bordered on the absurd, organising his entire daily routine around the chase and spending staggering amounts of time in the field after game. It was said he hunted nearly every single day, in almost any weather, treating it less as a pastime and more as a sacred duty. Picture a chief executive who runs a genuinely successful company, but insists on leaving the office every afternoon, without fail, to go stand in a forest with a rifle, and you have some sense of the man. He was also famously plain in his personal tastes and set in his habits, a creature of rigid routine who liked his days to unfold in exactly the same order. He was devout, disciplined, and almost aggressively unglamorous, more interested in results than in the theatrical splendour that other monarchs adored. In an era of powdered excess, Charles came across as almost stubbornly ordinary, a hard-working king who happened to also be fanatically devoted to chasing deer. It was an odd combination, competence and eccentricity bolted together, but after his troubled predecessors, Spain was more than willing to take it. The great test of his reign, though, would come not from war or foreign rivals, but from something far more mundane and far more revealing. Charles wanted to improve his subjects' lives whether they liked it or not, and that impulse, however well-meaning, was about to collide head-on with the pride of his own capital. His campaign to clean up and modernise Madrid would earn him lasting credit from historians, and, in the short term, a full-blown uprising over an issue so trivial it almost defies belief. When Charles III arrived in Madrid, he was reportedly horrified by the state of the city, which was, to put it kindly, filthy. Residents simply threw their waste out of the windows and into the streets, and the smell was legendary across Europe. Charles launched an ambitious campaign to clean the capital, installing street lighting, paving roads, building sewers, and dragging the city into something resembling modern hygiene. He was, in effect, a monarch waging personal war against garbage. He was also obsessively devoted to hunting, spending staggering amounts of time chasing game rather than sitting in meetings. But his enthusiasm for tidying up his subjects' lives was about to backfire in one of the most ridiculous rebellions in Spanish history, all triggered by an argument about clothing. The state of the city genuinely was appalling, and not in a mild way. The common method of waste disposal was to open a window and hurl the contents of a chamber pot into the street below, occasionally with a shouted warning, and occasionally without one, which made simply walking down a road a game of chance with dreadful stakes. The streets served as open channels for filth of every description. The stench hung over the city like a permanent fog, and the whole thing was a genuine public health disaster. If you have ever stepped in something unspeakable on a sidewalk and recoiled in disgust, imagine an entire capital where that was simply the ambient condition of existence. Charles found this intolerable, and to his credit he didn't merely complain about it. He set out to fix it with the same brisk determination he applied to everything else. He ordered the paving of streets, the construction of drains and sewers to carry away the waste, the collection of refuse, and the installation of street lamps to light the city at night. He wanted Madrid to become a capital worthy of a great empire, clean, orderly and modern, rather than a reeking maze that visitors wrote home about in horror. It was, by any reasonable measure, an admirable project, the sort of unglamorous civic improvement that quietly makes millions of lives better. The trouble was that people do not always thank you for improving them, especially when the improvement disrupts habits they have held for generations. Many residents grumbled at the new rules and the interference in their daily routines. Being told by the Crown that you could no longer fling your waste wherever you pleased, that you had to change the way you'd always done things, struck some as an intrusion rather than a gift. There is a stubborn streak in people, a resistance to being told what to do even when what they are being told is unquestionably sensible, and Charles was about to run straight into it. He was also, as ever, dividing his attention with his beloved hunting, disappearing into the field with almost religious regularity, while his ministers pushed his reforms forward on his behalf. This mattered, because much of the actual governing was carried out by the officials he appointed, some of them foreign-born, and that detail would soon become a lightning rod. When resentment finally boiled over, it would fasten not on the king himself, who remained broadly respected, but on his ministers and on one specific, seemingly trivial decree that touched something people were absurdly passionate about. Because Charles, having conquered the problem of garbage, decided to turn his reforming eye toward what his subjects were wearing. And it was there, in the matter of hats and capes of all things, that his tidy, sensible, well-intentioned modernization program would detonate into open revolt, sending one of Europe's most effective monarchs fleeing his own capital in a panic. The great clean-up had gone smoothly enough. The great wardrobe reform was about to go spectacularly wrong. In 1766, Charles III decided that the traditional long capes and wide-brimmed hats worn by Madrid's men were a public safety problem, because they let criminals hide their faces and conceal weapons. So he banned them. The response was not gratitude. The people of Madrid erupted into what became known as the Esquilache riots, furious that the crown was telling them how to dress. Crowds filled the streets, the king was forced to flee the capital, and one of Europe's most effective monarchs found himself chased out of his own city over fashion. It is a perfect snapshot of the era, a serious ruler undone by an argument about outerwear. Charles eventually restored order and kept reforming, but the throne he would leave behind was headed straight back into familiar chaos with his son. The logic behind the ban was not entirely unreasonable, which is what makes the whole affair so wonderfully ridiculous. The long cape reached nearly to the ground and could conceal a sword or a dagger with ease, and the broad-brimmed hat could be tilted down to hide a man's face almost completely. Put the two together, and you had, in the government's view, the perfect uniform for a criminal, someone who could carry a weapon unseen and vanish into a crowd unidentified. The decree ordered shorter capes and hats worn in a style that left the face visible, all in the name of public order. On paper it reads like a sensible bit of crime prevention. But clothing is never only clothing, and the people of Madrid did not experience this as a safety measure. They experienced it as an insult. The traditional cape and hat were a point of pride, a piece of identity, a way of dressing that felt distinctly and defiantly their own. To be told by the government how to dress, and to suspect that the order came at the urging of a foreign-born minister, touched a nerve far deeper than the specific garments involved. It felt like contempt dressed up as concern, a distant authority reaching into the most personal corner of daily life. Anyone who has ever bristled at being told what they can and cannot wear will recognize the feeling, just multiplied across an entire furious city. And so Madrid exploded. Crowds poured into the streets, and the protests swelled rapidly into a full-scale uprising, with the fury directed above all at the king's unpopular Italian minister, who was blamed for the hated decree and much else besides. The rioters demanded his removal along with the reversal of the clothing rules and other grievances. The situation grew genuinely dangerous, violent enough and widespread enough that the safety of the king himself came into question. What had begun as anger over hats had become a serious threat to public order. Faced with a capital in open revolt, Charles did something that must have stung the pride of so capable a ruler. He left. He withdrew from Madrid for his own safety, retreating from the chaos while the crisis raged. For a monarch who prided himself on control and competence, being driven out of his own city by a mob furious about outerwear was a humiliation of a very particular kind. He gave ground, dismissed the despised minister, and let the immediate storm blow itself out. But Charles was too shrewd to simply surrender. Once the fury cooled and order returned, he quietly resumed his reforms, having learned to move a little more carefully around his subjects' sensibilities while never abandoning his larger goals. He ruled on for years afterward as one of the most effective kings the dynasty ever produced. The tragedy was what came next. For all his competence, Charles could not reform his own heir, and the son who would inherit his hard-won achievements was a man whose great passion in life was not governing an empire but taking small mechanical objects apart and putting them back together again. Charles IV inherited the throne in 1788, and he was, to put it generously, not built for the job. Kind-hearted but weak-willed and easily led, Charles had little interest in the hard work of governing, and a great deal of interest in hunting and in tinkering with mechanical objects, particularly clocks and watches. He was genuinely happiest with a tiny screwdriver in his hand, fixing gears, while the actual empire creaked and groaned around him. This was a spectacularly bad time for a distracted, hands-off monarch, because the French Revolution was about to explode next door and reshape all of Europe. Spain needed a strong, focused leader. What it got was a man who would rather be repairing a pocket watch, and a wife who was more than happy to step into the vacuum he left behind. He was not, to be fair to him, a cruel or malicious man. Charles was pleasant, devout, and genuinely good-natured, the kind of person who is easy to like and difficult to respect. His flaws were not of character but of capacity. He lacked the drive, the sharpness, and the will to command that his father had possessed in abundance, and he had a fatal tendency to lean on whoever happened to be closest, trusting others to make the hard decisions so he would not have to. In a quiet age, such a king might have muddled along harmlessly. In the age he actually lived in, that softness would prove disastrous. His true happiness lay in his hobbies, and here the contrast with his responsibilities becomes almost painfully vivid. He shared his father's fanatical love of hunting, but he added to it a fascination with mechanisms, with the intricate inner workings of clocks and watches and other delicate contraptions. He loved to take them apart to study the tiny gears and springs, to repair and reassemble them with his own hands. There was a real and rather touching pleasure in it. The satisfaction of a small, solvable problem that behaves according to rules and rewards patient attention. The bitter irony is that he brought this care and focus to pocket watches while the vastly more complicated machinery of his empire went untended. Because an empire does not run itself, and the timing could hardly have been worse. Just as this gentle, distractible king settled onto the throne, the French Revolution erupted across the border, tearing down the old order, executing a king, and sending shockwaves of fear and upheaval through every monarchy in Europe. This was a moment that demanded a leader of exceptional nerve and clarity, someone who could navigate an unprecedented crisis and protect the kingdom from the chaos spilling out of France. It was precisely the kind of storm that required a firm hand on the wheel. Charles was not that hand, and he knew it, or at least he behaved as though he did. Rather than seize control of events, he receded from them, content to let others handle the exhausting business of statecraft while he pursued his passions. The natural result of a king who does not wish to rule is that someone else rules in his place, and the vacuum at the centre of Spanish power did not stay empty for long. Authority flowed, as it always does, toward those willing to grasp it. The person most willing to grasp it, as it turned out, was his own wife, a woman of considerable ambition and iron will, who looked at her amiable, gear-obsessed husband and saw not a partner but an opportunity. Between her drive and his indifference, the real government of Spain was about to slip almost entirely out of the king's soft hands and into hers, and into the hands of a strikingly handsome young man whose extraordinary rise would scandalize the entire nation. Charles IV's wife was Maria Louisa of Parma, a strong-willed and politically ambitious queen who quickly realised that her husband had no intention of running things himself, so she did. Maria Louisa took a firm grip on the levers of power, dominating court politics and influencing every major decision. But she did not rule alone. Alongside her rose one of the most controversial figures in the entire Bourbon story, a young man who came from relatively humble beginnings and climbed to the very top of the Spanish government with breathtaking speed. His rise was so meteoric and so obviously tangled up with the Queen's personal favour that all of Spain gossiped about it openly. His name was Manuel Godoy, and his story was about to become the scandal of the age. She was, in many ways, the natural counterpart to her passive husband, everything he was not. Where Charles was soft, she was hard. Where he was indifferent to power, she craved it. Where he wanted to be left alone with his gears and his hunting, she wanted to be at the very centre of things, shaping decisions and directing the course of the kingdom. In a marriage between a man who did not want to rule and a woman who very much did, there was never any real question about who would end up holding the reins. Maria Louisa took them without hesitation. Her dominance over her husband was widely recognised and widely resented. Charles trusted her judgment, deferred to her wishes, and allowed her enormous influence over appointments and policy, so that to win the favour of the crown, one increasingly had to win the favour of the Queen. She was shrewd, forceful, and determined to have her way, and she was not especially concerned with whether her methods made her popular. The court learned quickly that the true seat of power was not the amiable king but his formidable wife, and it adjusted its bowing and scraping accordingly. But the story of Maria Louisa cannot be told without the man whose fortunes became inseparable from hers, and here the tale takes its most scandalous turn. Into the Queen's orbit came a young man of modest background and remarkable good looks, and under her patronage he began an ascent so rapid and so extraordinary that it defied every ordinary rule of how advancement was supposed to work. Men of ancient noble families spent lifetimes clawing toward the heights of government. This young man seemed to arrive there almost overnight, and everyone knew exactly whose favour had carried him. The whispers were immediate and universal. All of Spain, from the highest grandee to the lowest street gossip, drew the obvious conclusion about the nature of the relationship between the Queen and her spectacular young favourite. The intimacy was assumed, the scandal was open, and the king, for his part, appeared either not to notice or not to mind, treating the young man with warmth and trust even as tongues wagged across the capital. It was the kind of situation that would be unbelievable if it were not so thoroughly documented. A royal marriage, a rising favourite, and a nation gossiping openly about all three. What makes it more than mere scandal, though, is that this young favourite did not remain a mere companion. He was handed real and enormous power, elevated to the very summit of the Spanish government, entrusted with steering the empire through the most dangerous period in generations. A former palace guardsman was about to find himself effectively running a great European state at the exact moment that state most needed brilliant leadership. Whether he was equal to that task, and whether anyone could have been, is where his remarkable story truly begins. Manuel Godoy began his career as a member of the Royal Guard, a good-looking young man of modest noble background with no particular qualifications for high office. Within just a few years, he had rocketed up to become the most powerful minister in Spain, effectively running the country on behalf of the king and queen. Nearly everyone assumed this astonishing rise was due to his very close relationship with Queen Maria Louisa, and the whispers followed him everywhere. He was even granted the grand title of Prince of the Peace, an honour almost unheard of for a man of his origins. For a while, Godoy held the fate of the empire in his hands, but but steering Spain through the age of Napoleon was a task that would crush far more capable men, and Godoy was steering directly into the storm. His starting point makes the ascent all the more staggering. Godoy came from a family of minor provincial nobility, the sort of background that might, in the ordinary course of things, secure a comfortable but unremarkable life. He entered the Royal Guard as a young man, one uniformed figure among many, with nothing to obviously mark him out except his looks and his charm. There was no great fortune behind him, no powerful family network, no long record of service or proven brilliance in statecraft. By every conventional measure, he was an unlikely candidate for supreme power. And yet the rise happened with dizzying speed. The kind of promotion trajectory that would make a modern intern who somehow becomes chief executive within a couple of years look positively sluggish. He gathered titles, wealth, estates, and offices at a pace that left the old aristocracy gasping with envy and resentment. Before long, he was not merely a minister, but the dominant figure in the entire government, the man through whom decisions flowed, the favourite who held the confidence of both the king and the queen. He had leapfrogged over families who had spent centuries accumulating prestige, and they did not forgive him for it. The grandest of his honours was the extraordinary title bestowed upon him after he negotiated a peace agreement, an honorific so exalted that it was almost absurd for a man of his origins to hold it. To crown a former guardsman with such a distinction was to announce, in the most public way imaginable, just how completely he had captured the favour of the crown. It also painted an enormous target on his back. The higher he climbed, the more he was resented, and the more the whispers about how he had climbed so high multiplied and hardened into open contempt. For a time, though, none of that mattered, because he had the one thing that counted, the unwavering support of the royal couple. As long as the king trusted him and the queen favoured him, Godoy was untouchable, the true ruler of Spain in all but name. He wielded genuine authority over the direction of the kingdom, its policies, its alliances and its wars, a young man from the provinces suddenly responsible for the fate of a global empire. It was a remarkable thing to witness, and for a while it must have felt to him like an unstoppable ascent. But he had risen to the top at the worst possible moment in modern European history. Just as Godoy took the wheel, the continent was being swallowed by the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte, a force that would humble far greater statesmen than a former palace bodyguard. Navigating Spain safely through that storm would have challenged a genius. Godoy was clever and ambitious, but he was no genius, and the decisions he would make while trying to keep his country afloat would ultimately help drag it into catastrophe. His story would end not in triumph, but in a mob's fury. Before that reckoning, though, the strange court he helped run would be immortalised forever by a painter who saw them all with pitiless clarity. During this period, one of the greatest artists in history was working directly for the Spanish crown, the painter Francisco Goya. Hired as a court painter, Goya produced grand official portraits of the royal family, and here is the fascinating part. He painted them exactly as they were, plain, awkward, and utterly without flattering idealization. His famous group portrait of Charles IV and his family shows them looking stiff, vain, and slightly ridiculous, and historians have debated for centuries whether Goya was subtly mocking them or simply painting what he saw. Either way, the royal family reportedly loved it. There is something deeply telling about a dynasty that hired a genius to immortalize them and ended up with a portrait that looks like a group of confused people waiting at a train station. Meanwhile, the real drama was building outside the frame. Goya was no ordinary court painter, and that is precisely what makes these portraits so extraordinary. He was one of the towering artistic talents of his or any age, a man of piercing perception whose work would go on to influence the entire course of modern art. The Spanish crown had in effect hired the finest possible eye to record them for posterity, and that eye did not lie. Where a lesser painter might have smoothed away every flaw and flattered his patrons into idealized perfection, Goya rendered them with an almost startling honesty, capturing not just their features, but something of their essence. The great group portrait of the royal family is the most famous example, and it is a genuinely strange painting to sit with. The figures stand arranged in their finery, glittering with medals and jewels and silk, and yet there is nothing majestic about them. They look ordinary, even faintly comical, their expressions blank or vain or vaguely uncomfortable, as though caught in a moment they had not quite prepared for. The Queen occupies the centre with an air of unmistakable authority. The King stands there amiable and slightly vacant, and the whole assembly radiates a kind of awkward, human ordinariness utterly at odds with the grandeur of their costumes. It is the visual equivalent of a family photo where everyone is dressed magnificently, but no one quite knows what to do with their hands. This has fueled centuries of debate. Some look at the painting and see quiet mockery, an artist slyly exposing the mediocrity and vanity of his royal patrons while pretending to honour them, hiding his true opinion in plain sight. Others argue that Goya was simply being truthful, painting what he genuinely saw without malice, and that the awkwardness we perceive is merely honesty in an age that expected flattery. The truth is probably unknowable, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the work endure. Was it satire or sincerity, contempt or candour? The painting refuses to say. The most delicious detail is that the royal family, by all accounts, was pleased with the result. They did not recoil from being shown as plain and slightly ridiculous. They accepted it, perhaps because they could not see themselves the way the painter and posterity would, perhaps because the sheer splendour of their costumes satisfied their vanity regardless of their faces. There is a strange lesson buried in there about self-awareness, or the lack of it, a dynasty gazing at an unflinching mirror and somehow seeing only the jewels. While Goya was fixing this awkward tableau onto canvas, the world beyond the frame was sliding toward catastrophe. The Queen dominated, the King drifted, the favourite schemed and stumbled, and across the border the most formidable conqueror of the age was turning his gaze toward a weak and divided Spain. The portrait captured a family frozen in a moment of gilded complacency, blissfully unaware that the ground was about to open beneath them. Very soon, that awkward, medal-draped complacency would be shattered by fury from within and menace from without, beginning with a violent explosion of public rage at the very palace gates. By 1808, discontent with Charles IV and the hated Godoy had reached a breaking point. At the royal residence of Aranjuez, a mutiny erupted, driven by furious crowds, disgruntled nobles, and soldiers who had had enough. Godoy was hunted down and nearly killed, and in the chaos Charles IV was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of his son Ferdinand. For one brief moment, it looked like the crisis had resolved itself with a change of king. But this was 1808, and lurking just across the border was a man who specialised in exploiting exactly this kind of family meltdown. Napoleon Bonaparte had been watching the whole embarrassing spectacle, and he was about to make his move. The resentment had been building for years, and by this point it had curdled into something explosive. Godoy was blamed for nearly everything that had gone wrong, and a great deal had gone wrong. His management of Spain's affairs had led the country into military humiliation and financial strain, and his cosy dealings with the French had left Spain dangerously entangled with Napoleon, with French troops actually moving into the country under arrangements Godoy had helped make. To the public, he was the arrogant upstart who had risen impossibly high on the Queen's favour and then steered the nation into disaster. The hatred for him was intense and personal. There was also a bitter rift within the royal family itself, which sharpened the crisis considerably. The king's son and heir, Ferdinand, despised Godoy and resented his own sideline position, and he became a natural rallying point for everyone who wanted the favourite gone. Around Ferdinand gathered the discontented nobles and courtiers, who saw in him an alternative to the failing regime of his parents and their detested minister. The stage was set for a confrontation, with a frustrated heir on one side and an unpopular favourite propped up by an ageing, indifferent king on the other. When the explosion came at Aranjuez, it was sudden and violent. Crowds and mutinous soldiers rose up, and their fury fixed above all on Godoy. He was hunted through the royal residence, and for a time his life hung by a thread as the mob searched for him. According to the accounts, he survived only by hiding, enduring a terrifying ordeal before he was finally captured, battered and humiliated, his glittering career collapsing around him in a matter of hours. The man who'd been crowned with an almost absurd title of honour was reduced to a hunted fugitive cowering from a mob, one of the more complete reversals of fortune the dynasty ever produced. With his favourite seized and his own position crumbling, the ageing king had no fight left in him. Charles IV, never a man of iron resolve, buckled under the pressure and abdicated the throne in favour of his son. In an instant, Ferdinand became king, and the crowds that had risen against Godoy now had their triumph, a new monarch who seemed to represent everything the old regime was not. For a brief, giddy moment, it looked as though the storm had passed. The hated favourite was finished, the unpopular old king was gone, and a fresh reign had begun amid public rejoicing. It was an illusion, and a dangerous one. The Spanish royal family had just staged a very public, very messy implosion, airing its bitter internal feud and its weakness for all of Europe to see. And the most dangerous man on the continent had been watching every humiliating minute of it. To Napoleon, a squabbling dynasty tearing itself apart on his doorstep was not a tragedy but an invitation. Both the fallen father and the triumphant son were about to be lured into a trap so cynical and so effective that it would cost them not just their crowns but their entire empire. Sensing weakness, Napoleon lured both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand across the border into France, ostensibly to mediate their bitter family dispute over who was the rightful king. It was a trap. Once he had them, Napoleon pressured both men into surrendering their claims to the throne entirely, and then handed the Spanish crown to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. In one cynical manoeuvre, the entire squabbling Bourbon family had managed to lose their empire to a foreign general simply because they could not stop fighting each other. The Spanish people, however, did not accept their new French king, and they rose up in a brutal war of resistance. When the dust of that long and bloody conflict finally settled, the Bourbons would return, and the man coming back was arguably the worst of them all. The trap worked because it played perfectly on the family's own dysfunction. Charles, having abdicated, now claimed he had done so under duress and wanted his throne back, while Ferdinand insisted he was the rightful king. The two of them were locked in a bitter, undignified quarrel over the crown, and Napoleon offered himself as the wise, neutral arbiter who would settle the matter fairly. It was an offer designed to appeal to two proud, frightened men, each convinced that the great emperor would surely rule in his favour. Both took the bait and crossed into France to make their cases, walking willingly into the jaws of the man they should have feared most. Once he had them on his own soil and safely separated from any Spanish support, Napoleon dropped the pretense. There would be no fair mediation. Instead, he applied relentless pressure, browbeating and manipulating both father and son until each surrendered his claim to the Spanish throne. It was a masterclass in cold-blooded political maneuvering. The Bourbons had spent so much energy fighting each other that they had failed to notice they were both being maneuvered off the board entirely, their rivalry exploited to strip them of the very prize they were fighting over. In the end, both walked away with nothing. With the throne conveniently vacated, Napoleon simply gave it away. He placed the crown of Spain on the head of his own brother, installing a Bonaparte as king of a country that had just been swindled out of its own dynasty. It was breathtaking in its audacity, the seizure of a great empire accomplished not through a hard-fought conquest, but through a clever ruse played on a feuding family. If you have ever watched relatives destroy something valuable by refusing to cooperate, handing an advantage to an outsider who calmly walks off with the prize, you have seen this story in miniature. The Bourbons had done exactly that, only the prize was an empire. But Napoleon had badly misjudged one thing. He could manipulate the royal family, but he could not so easily impose a foreign king on the Spanish people, who reacted to the whole cynical scheme with volcanic rage. They refused to accept the emperor's brother as their monarch, and instead of a smooth transfer of power, Napoleon found himself facing a furious, determined popular uprising. The country erupted into resistance, and what followed was a long, savage, grinding war fought street by street and village by village, a brutal conflict that would drain French strength and become a byword for ferocity. That war would rage for years, leaving deep scars across the land and eventually helping to break Napoleon's grip on Europe. And when it was finally over and the French were driven out, the Spanish throne would be waiting, empty, for the return of its old dynasty. The man who had come back to claim it was the same son who had been tricked across the border, Ferdinand, hailed in his absence as a beloved saviour. The tragedy for Spain was that the saviour they had dreamed of turned out to be, by almost any measure, the most treacherous and disappointing king the whole troubled family ever produced. When the French were finally driven out, Ferdinand VII returned to reclaim the throne in 1814. During his exile, he'd been called the Desired One, because the suffering Spanish people had romanticized him as their saviour. That fantasy did not survive contact with reality. Ferdinand turned out to be vindictive, treacherous, and dishonest to a degree that shocked even his allies, earning himself a far less flattering nickname over time. He betrayed nearly everyone who had fought to restore him, and he wielded power with paranoid cruelty. The man his people had dreamed of for years turned out to be a walking disappointment in a crown, and his first major act upon returning was to take a wrecking ball to the very idea of Spanish freedom. The adoration that greeted his return was genuine and enormous, which makes what followed all the more bitter. Throughout the long years of war and occupation, the Spanish people had clung to the idea of Ferdinand as a symbol of everything they were fighting for, an almost mythical figure who would restore the nation and reward the sacrifices of those who had suffered for him. They had bled and died in a brutal war partly in his name, imagining that his return would usher in a golden age. When he finally came back, he was welcomed as a hero and a deliverer, the Desired One made flesh. The stage was set for a joyful new beginning. The joy curdled almost immediately. Ferdinand proved to be exactly the wrong man for the moment, a ruler whose defining traits were suspicion, vengefulness, and a slippery disregard for his own promises. Those who had governed and fought in his absence, who had kept the flame of Spanish resistance alive, soon discovered that their loyalty counted for nothing. He turned on former allies, punished those who had served the national cause, and surrounded himself with an atmosphere of fear and intrigue. Over time, the flattering nickname of his exile gave way to darker judgments, as his subjects learned the hard way what kind of man they had actually longed for. His treachery became almost legendary. He had a habit of making agreements and then breaking them the moment they no longer served him, of embracing people warmly one day and destroying them the next, of ruling through manipulation and betrayal rather than principle. Even those who worked closely with him found they could not trust his word, because his word meant whatever was most convenient to him in the moment. It is a rare thing for a monarch to shock his own supporters with his dishonesty, but Ferdinand managed it repeatedly, leaving a trail of disillusioned allies in his wake. The cruelty was not merely personal, but political, expressed through a campaign of repression against those who held liberal ideas about how Spain should be governed. He was determined to restore his own absolute authority in full, and he was prepared to crush anyone who stood in the way of that ambition. The hopeful, forward-looking spirit that had emerged during the years of struggle was met not with gratitude but with persecution. The saviour had become a persecutor, turning the machinery of the state against the very people who had imagined him as their liberator. His single most consequential act upon returning captured the whole tragedy in one stroke. While he had been away, Spanish patriots had laboured to build something new, a framework of law meant to limit royal power and secure the rights of the people, a genuine attempt at a freer future forged in the crucible of war. The nation expected its beloved returning king to honour and embrace this achievement. Instead, Ferdinand set out to demolish it entirely, sweeping away the reforms and reasserting his own unchecked rule. That act of destruction, tearing up the hopeful charter his people had created, would define the bitter, backward-looking character of his reign, and it is where the story turns next. While Ferdinand VII was away, Spanish patriots had drafted a remarkably progressive constitution in 1812, one that limited royal power and established liberal rights. The people expected their beloved returning king to embrace it. Instead, Ferdinand promptly abolished it, restored absolute monarchy, and launched a campaign of repression against the very liberals who had fought to bring him home. He ruled through fear, reversing reforms and clinging to total control with both hands. His reign became a grim seesaw of absolutism and forced concessions, but Ferdinand's most lasting damage would not come from his politics. It would come from something far more personal and far more Bourbon. His ongoing failure to solve the one problem every dynasty is supposed to solve. The constitution he tore up was a genuinely bold document for its time, produced by patriots meeting in the besieged city of Cadiz while the war still raged around them. It sought to place limits on the crown, to establish rights for citizens, and to give the nation a voice in its own governance rather than leaving everything to the whims of a single ruler. It was the work of people who had risked everything, drafting a vision of a freer Spain even as French armies occupied much of the country. To its authors, it represented hope, the idea that all the suffering might produce something better than what had come before. Ferdinand looked at that hope and decided to erase it. Almost as soon as he was securely back on the throne, he declared the constitution void, as if the years of struggle behind it had never happened, and reasserted his right to rule with absolute and unchecked authority. It was the political equivalent of an employee working nights and weekends to build something meaningful, only for the boss to return from a long absence, glance at it, and delete the whole thing without a word of thanks. The liberals who had fought for reform found their achievements swept away, and themselves marked as enemies of the crown. What followed was a period of harsh repression. Ferdinand pursued the reformers with vindictive energy, imprisoning, exiling, and punishing those who had championed the new order. Fear settled over political life, as the king made clear that dissent would not be tolerated, and that the old absolutism was back with a vengeance. The bright forward-looking energy of the war years was smothered, replaced by suspicion and persecution. For those who had dreamed of a freer Spain, the return of their desired king had become a nightmare. His reign did not remain stable, however, because pressure of that kind rarely stays contained. At one point, a revolt forced him to accept the very constitution he had abolished, and for a few years he was compelled to rule as a limited monarch, seething under restrictions he despised. Then outside intervention restored his absolute power once more, and the repression resumed. His reign lurched back and forth in this manner, between forced concession and reasserted tyranny, a seesaw that left the country exhausted and bitterly divided. It was governance as a running battle between a king who wanted total control and a nation that would not entirely surrender the idea of its own rights. But for all the political turmoil, the damage that would echo longest after Ferdinand was gone had nothing to do with constitutions or repression. It was rooted in the oldest royal anxiety of all, the desperate need to produce an heir. For years, Ferdinand married and remarried in an increasingly frantic effort to father a child who could inherit his throne, and his failure to do so cleanly would set a trap for the future. The way he eventually tried to solve that problem would plunge Spain into open civil war and shape the rest of the dynasty's troubled century. And it began with a simple, stubborn fact that wife after wife brought him no surviving child. Ferdinand VII married 4 separate times, chiefly in an increasingly anxious quest to produce an heir who could inherit the throne. Wife after wife came and went without a surviving child, and the aging king grew desperate. Spanish law at the time followed a rule that favoured male heirs and could exclude women from the throne entirely, which meant that if Ferdinand died without a son, the crown would pass to his brother. This was a genuine dynastic emergency, and Ferdinand, running out of time and options, was prepared to rewrite the fundamental rules of succession to protect his own bloodline. When his 4th wife finally gave him a child, and that child was a daughter, Ferdinand made a decision that would plunge Spain into decades of civil war. The pressure on a monarch to produce an heir was immense, the single most important dynastic duty of all, and it was a pressure Ferdinand felt acutely as the years slipped by. A king without a clear successor was a king presiding over future chaos, because an unsettled succession was an open invitation to conflict. Each marriage carried the hope that this time, at last, a healthy heir would arrive to secure the line, and each time that hope was disappointed, whether through the death of a wife or the absence of a surviving child. It was, in its way, a quietly agonizing situation. The most powerful man in the country unable to accomplish the one thing his position most demanded. Complicating everything was the specific rule governing the Spanish succession, which favoured male heirs and threatened to shut a daughter out of the throne entirely. Under that arrangement, if Ferdinand died without a son, the crown would not pass to any daughter he might have, but would instead go sideways to his brother, Carlos. This was not a hypothetical concern. It was a looming likelihood, and it meant that the entire future of the direct line depended on either producing a boy or changing the rules. Ferdinand's brother naturally was quite content with the existing arrangement, since it positioned him to inherit everything. Faced with the real possibility of dying heirless, Ferdinand grew increasingly determined to alter the law itself. If nature would not provide him a son, then he would rewrite the rules so that a daughter could inherit in a son's place. It was a drastic step, tampering with the fundamental order of succession, the kind of change guaranteed to enrage anyone whose expectations it upset. But Ferdinand, ever willing to bend rules to suit his purposes, was prepared to do exactly that in order to keep the throne within his own immediate family, rather than handing it to a brother he had no wish to favour. Then, late in his life and after so many disappointments, his 4th wife finally gave him a living child. It was a moment of enormous relief and joy for the aging king, the answer to years of anxious waiting. There was only one complication, and from a strictly dynastic point of view under the old rules it was a significant one. The child was a girl. Under the existing law, this daughter might be barred from the throne, which meant the arrival of a healthy heir had not actually solved his problem. It had simply made the looming legal collision unavoidable. And so Ferdinand made his fateful choice. Determined that his daughter would inherit, he moved to overturn the old rule and clear her path to the crown, directly at the expense of his brother's expectations. It was a decision made out of paternal love and dynastic self-interest, and it was entirely in keeping with his habit of reshaping the rules to fit his desires. But this particular change would not be quietly accepted. It struck at the deepest question of who had the right to rule, and it lit a fuse that would explode into a long and bloody struggle the moment Ferdinand closed his eyes for the last time. To ensure his infant daughter Isabella could inherit, Ferdinand VII issued a decree overturning the old rule and allowing a female to take the throne. His brother Carlos, who had been comfortably expecting to become king himself, was furious and refused to accept it. When Ferdinand died in 1833, the kingdom split violently between supporters of little Isabella and supporters of her uncle Carlos. The result was the Carlist Wars, a long and bloody series of conflicts fought over which branch of the same royal family deserved the crown. An entire nation was dragged into slaughter because two relatives could not agree on who got the throne, and the child at the centre of it all, the baby queen everyone was fighting over, was about to have one of the most turbulent reigns imaginable. The decree that cleared Isabella's path was, from Carlos's point of view, an act of theft. He had spent his life comfortably assuming that his brother's lack of a son would eventually make him king, and that assumption had shaped his entire sense of his own future. To have it overturned by a stroke of the pen, so that an infant girl could leapfrog him in the line of succession, struck him as an outrageous injustice. He simply refused to recognise the change, insisting that the old rules must stand and that the throne was rightfully his. It was the ultimate family inheritance dispute, except the inheritance was an empire, and the disagreement would be settled with armies rather than lawyers. When Ferdinand died and the little girl was proclaimed queen under a regency, the disagreement burst into open warfare. Carlos and his supporters rose up in arms, refusing to accept the child's claim, and the country split into two hostile camps. On one side stood those who backed Isabella, who tended also to favour a more liberal and constitutional direction for Spain. On the other stood the Carlists, who rallied behind Carlos and generally championed a more traditional, absolutist and religiously conservative vision. What had begun as a family quarrel over succession quickly absorbed the deeper divisions running through Spanish society, becoming a struggle over the entire future direction of the nation. The fighting was long, brutal, and bitter, tearing through the country in a series of conflicts that would recur over the following decades. This was not a single tidy war with a clean ending, but a prolonged agony, a wound that kept reopening, pitting Spaniard against Spaniard and region against region. The human cost was enormous, and the bitterness it generated poisoned Spanish politics for generations. All of it flowed from that single decision to change the rules of inheritance, a reminder that in a monarchy the private choices of one family could set an entire country ablaze. There is something almost darkly absurd about the root of it all. Strip away the grand political principles that later attached themselves to the struggle, and at its core the war began because two members of the same family could not agree on who deserved to sit in a particular chair. Uncle and infant niece became the figureheads of rival armies, their supporters slaughtering one another over a question of lineage. It is the kind of dispute that, in an ordinary family, might result in a frosty holiday dinner. In a royal one, it resulted in years of civil war. At the very centre of this storm sat the baby queen herself, Isabella, a child who understood none of it, and had asked for none of it, yet in whose name men fought and died. She would grow up amid conflict, intrigue, and instability, shaped from her earliest years by the turmoil that surrounded her accession. Her reign, when she was finally old enough to exercise it, would prove every bit as turbulent as its violent beginning, marked by chaos, scandal, and a rotating cast of powerful figures manoeuvring around a queen who had been placed on the throne before she could even walk. Isabella II became queen when she was not even 3 years old, which meant that for years the actual business of ruling fell to a rotating cast of regents, generals, and advisors, starting with her mother. This arrangement produced exactly the stability you would expect, which is to say, almost none. Spain lurched through coups, uprisings, shifting governments, and constant political intrigue while the young queen grew up in the middle of the storm. She was surrounded by ambitious men jockeying for control, raised in an atmosphere of scandal and instability, and given very little preparation for the impossible role she had inherited. By the time Isabella was old enough to rule in her own right, the damage was done, and her personal life was about to become nearly as controversial as her politics. A monarch who is barely more than a toddler cannot govern, and so power inevitably falls to whoever is positioned to seize it in her name. In Isabella's case, that meant a succession of regents and strongmen, beginning with her mother, who held authority during the earliest years while the Carlist War raged. But regencies are inherently unstable arrangements, tempting to the ambitious and vulnerable to intrigue, and Spain's proved no exception. Control passed from hand to hand amid quarrels and power struggles, as one figure after another rose to dominate the government before being pushed aside by the next. The result was a childhood spent at the eye of a political hurricane. Where an ordinary child might worry about lessons and games, Isabella grew up amid coups and uprisings, watching governments rise and fall around her, aware from her earliest years that she was both the most important person in the kingdom and, in practice, one of the most powerless. The generals and politicians who circled her treated the young queen as a prize to be controlled, rather than a person to be nurtured. It was an upbringing designed almost perfectly to produce an insecure and poorly prepared ruler, surrounded by manipulation and starved of genuine guidance. Her education and preparation for the throne suffered accordingly. Caught between competing factions, each with its own agenda, she received little of the steady, disciplined grounding that the daunting task ahead of her demanded. Instead, she absorbed the lessons of a court defined by scandal, favoritism, and shifting loyalties, learning that power was something to be grasped and defended rather than exercised for the good of the realm. Imagine being handed the top position in an organization while still a small child, then being raised by a rotating series of rivals who each want to use you for their own ends, and you have some sense of the environment that shaped her. When she finally came of age and began to rule in her own name, she brought all of that instability with her. The habits and weaknesses formed in her chaotic youth followed her into adulthood, and her personal reign proved as turbulent as the regency that preceded it. She leaned on favourites, meddled in politics according to personal loyalties rather than sound judgment, and struggled to provide the steady leadership the country so badly needed. The child who had been a pawn grew into a queen who could not quite master the game. And there was another dimension to the coming turbulence, one that would prove just as damaging to her standing as any political misstep. Isabella's personal life, her marriage, and the rumours that swirled around it, was about to become a source of national scandal, dragging the monarchy's reputation through the mud. In an age when a ruler's private conduct was inseparable from public respect for the crown, the drama of her court would erode her authority as surely as any coup, turning her reign into a byword for both political chaos and personal notoriety. Isabella II's reign became infamous for its personal drama. Her marriage was arranged to her own cousin, Francisco de Assis, a man widely rumoured to have no romantic interest in women whatsoever, which made the union deeply unhappy from the start. Isabella, meanwhile, was rumoured to have taken a long series of lovers, and the gossip about the royal bedroom became a national and even international spectacle. Her court was seen as corrupt, chaotic, and morally scandalous, and her habit of meddling in politics based on personal favourites did nothing to stabilise the country. Spain was growing tired of the whole circus. The mood was turning against her, and it was only a matter of time before the frustration boiled over into open revolt. The marriage itself was a political calculation gone badly wrong. Rather than a match made for compatibility or affection, it was arranged for reasons of state and dynastic convenience, pairing the young queen with a cousin who was, by all accounts, spectacularly ill-suited to her. The union was unhappy almost from the first, a marriage in name and appearance rather than in any real emotional sense. It set the tone for everything that followed, a royal household built on a foundation of mutual disappointment, providing neither the personal happiness the Queen craved, nor the stable dynastic partnership the country needed. Into that void of affection poured a great deal of gossip. Isabella was rumoured to have sought comfort and companionship elsewhere, taking a series of favourites and lovers whose comings and goings became the subject of endless speculation. The details of the royal marriage and the Queen's private conduct were whispered about across Spain and beyond, turning the monarchy into a source of scandalous entertainment. In an age long before modern celebrity culture, Isabella's court managed to generate the same breathless, disapproving fascination, her personal affairs becoming a spectacle that everyone discussed and few respected. The problem was not merely that the gossip was unflattering, but that it corroded the dignity and authority of the crown itself. A monarch's ability to command loyalty rested heavily on public respect, and a court seen as corrupt, chaotic, and morally scandalous forfeited that respect steadily over time. The endless drama made the monarchy look ridiculous and unserious, at a moment when Spain desperately needed a figure of stability and dignity. Every fresh scandal chipped away at the reverence that was supposed to surround the throne, leaving it exposed and vulnerable. Compounding the personal chaos was the Queen's approach to governing, which mirrored the disorder of her private life. She had a habit of involving herself in politics on the basis of personal favour rather than sound principle, elevating and discarding ministers according to her attachments and whims. This made for a government as unstable and unpredictable as her court, lurching from crisis to crisis without steady direction. A country already worn down by decades of turmoil found itself led by a queen who seemed unable to separate her personal loyalties from the serious business of running a nation. By this point, Spain's patience was wearing dangerously thin. The combination of political instability, governmental chaos, and relentless personal scandal had drained away much of whatever goodwill the monarchy once enjoyed. The Queen, who had been fought over as an infant, in whose name a civil war had been waged, was fast becoming a figure of national frustration and embarrassment. The accumulated resentment was reaching a breaking point, and the powerful men of the army and the political class were beginning to conclude that the situation could not continue. A reckoning was coming, and when it arrived it would sweep the scandal-ridden Queen right off her throne and out of the country. In 1868, a coalition of generals and politicians launched an uprising grandly named the Glorious Revolution, and it swept Isabella II right off her throne. Deeply unpopular and out of allies, the Queen fled across the border into France, where she would live out much of the rest of her life in comfortable exile, watching from afar as Spain tried to figure out what to do without a Bourbon in charge. The country experimented with a different king, then briefly with a republic, none of which stuck particularly well. Spain, it turned out, had a complicated relationship with its dysfunctional royal family. It could not quite live with them, and it could not quite live without them, and before long the Bourbons would come knocking once again. The uprising had been building for a long time, fed by all the accumulated grievances of her reign, the instability, the scandals, the sense that the monarchy had become an embarrassment rather than an anchor. When it finally came, it came from the very people who might otherwise have propped her up, a coalition of military leaders and politicians who had concluded that Spain would be better off without her. The grand name they gave their movement reflected the hope that they were ushering in something better, sweeping away a discredited regime in favour of a fresh start. Whatever else it achieved, it certainly swept away the Queen. Isabella, isolated and stripped of support, had little choice but to flee. The Queen, who had been the centre of so much fighting and intrigue since infancy, now found herself an exile, crossing into France to escape the revolution that had toppled her. There she settled into a comfortable enough life abroad, a former monarch watching the affairs of her homeland from a distance, no longer able to shape them. It was an inglorious end to a reign that had begun in war and proceeded through decades of chaos. The fought-over child queen reduced at last to a spectator of her own country's continuing turmoil. What followed her departure demonstrated just how difficult the Bourbons were to replace. Having ejected their queen, the Spanish struggled to settle on what should come next. They tried importing a monarch from another royal house, an experiment that failed to take root and ended with the man giving up in frustration. Then they attempted a republic, doing away with monarchy altogether, but that too proved unstable and short-lived, unable to establish itself firmly amid the country's deep divisions. Spain seemed unable to find a stable alternative to the very dynasty it had just rejected. This awkward dance revealed a peculiar truth about Spain's relationship with the Bourbons. For all the dynasty's dysfunction, all its madness and scandal and incompetence, the country could not easily do without it. The Bourbons were exasperating, embarrassing, and frequently disastrous, yet they were also woven deeply into the fabric of Spanish identity and the structure of Spanish power. Getting rid of them created a vacuum that nothing else seemed able to fill for long. It was the political equivalent of a family that cannot stand living together, but somehow cannot function apart either, forever breaking up and reuniting. And so, almost inevitably, the pull toward restoration grew. Having tried the alternatives and found them wanting, Spain began to look back toward the familiar dynasty it had so recently cast out. The path opened for the Bourbons to return, this time through Isabella's son, a young man who represented a fresh face for the old line. His restoration would bring, for a change, a genuine if brief interval of calm and stability, a rare bright spot in the family's turbulent story. It would not last long, but after everything that had come before, even a short reprieve felt like a gift. The Bourbons returned to power through Isabella's son, Alfonso XII, who took the throne in 1874 and, for a change, brought a measure of genuine calm and stability to the exhausted country. He was reasonably popular and seemed poised to steady the dynasty at last after decades of turmoil. But the family's luck held true to form. Alfonso XII fell ill with tuberculosis and died in 1885 while still a young man, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a nation holding its breath. The next king of Spain had not even been born yet, which set up one of the strangest coronations in European history, a monarch who was king from the very first moment of his life. His restoration came as a genuine relief to a country worn ragged by upheaval. After the chaos of his mother's reign, the failed experiment with a foreign king, and the brief unstable republic, Spain was desperate for something steady, and the young Alfonso seemed to offer exactly that. He returned as a symbol of stability and reconciliation, a fresh representative of the old dynasty who carried none of the personal baggage that had sunk his mother. There was a sense, for once, that the monarchy might settle into a calmer and more constructive role, and the country allowed itself a measure of cautious optimism. For a time, that optimism seemed justified. Alfonso proved reasonably popular and presided over a period of relative political stability, a welcome contrast to the near-constant crisis that had preceded him. The savage divisions that had torn at the country began, at least on the surface, to ease somewhat, and the constitutional arrangements established during his reign brought a degree of order to the chaos of Spanish politics. He was, by the standards of his family, doing remarkably well, steering the ship of state with a steadiness that had been in desperately short supply. After so many disastrous reigns, a competent and unremarkable one felt almost miraculous. But the Bourbon luck, so reliably bad, was not about to make an exception. Alfonso fell victim to tuberculosis, one of the great killers of the age, a disease that respected no crown and could not be bargained with. Despite his youth and his position, there was little that could be done, and he died while still a young man, cutting short a reign that had only just begun to deliver on its promise. The stable, hopeful interlude collapsed almost as soon as it had been established, snatched away by illness in the cruelest possible timing. Once again, Spain was plunged into uncertainty, the brief bright moment extinguished. His death left behind an extraordinary and precarious situation. His wife was pregnant at the time he died, which meant that the question of the succession could not be immediately resolved. If the unborn child proved to be a son, then that child, not yet even born, would be the rightful king, and so the entire nation found itself in a strange state of suspended animation, waiting to learn who its next monarch would be. The throne held in a kind of limbo until the birth. It was a genuinely bizarre constitutional predicament, an empire pausing on the threshold of a nursery. The resolution of that suspense would produce one of the most remarkable stories in the whole long saga of the Spanish crown. The child, when it arrived, would inherit the throne in a manner almost unheard of in the annals of European monarchy, becoming king not through the death of a reigning parent he had known, nor through any ceremony of succession in the ordinary sense, but from the very instant of his first breath. Spain was about to have a king who was born already wearing the crown, and his life would be as dangerous and dramatic as his entrance into the world was strange. When Alfonso XII died, his widow was expecting a child, and so Spain simply waited to see who would emerge. The baby was a boy, and he became King Alfonso XIII the instant he was born in 1886, making him king before he could even open his eyes. He ruled under his mother's regency until he came of age, and his life was marked by extraordinary danger. On his wedding day, an assassin hurled a bomb at the royal procession, killing and wounding many bystanders, while the young king and his bride narrowly survived, spattered, but alive. He would face repeated attempts on his life throughout his reign. Alfonso XIII clung to the throne through decades of mounting instability, but the century was turning, and the ground beneath the monarchy was about to give way completely. His birth into kingship is one of those historical details that sounds invented but is entirely true. Because his father had died before he arrived, there was no living king for him to succeed in the usual way. Instead, the throne had been held vacant, waiting, and at the moment of his birth the infant simply was the king, sovereign of a great nation before he had drawn a second breath. It is difficult to imagine a stranger start to a life, entering the world not merely as a prince, but as a reigning monarch, the head of state while still in the cradle, entirely unaware of the enormous role that had landed on his tiny shoulders. Naturally, an infant cannot rule, so his mother governed as regent through the long years of his childhood, holding the crown in trust until he grew old enough to take up its duties himself. He came of age and assumed personal rule as a young man, stepping into the full responsibilities of a throne he had technically occupied his entire life. From the beginning, then, his existence was defined by the crown, in a way few monarchs ever experience, having quite literally never known a single day of life without it. There was no before, no ordinary childhood interrupted by sudden elevation. There was only the crown from the very first. The danger that shadowed him was real and persistent. The most dramatic instance came on his wedding day, an occasion that should have been one of pure celebration and instead became a scene of horror. As the royal procession moved through the streets, an assassin threw a bomb, and the explosion killed and injured numerous people nearby. The king and his new bride survived, but only narrowly, emerging from the carnage physically unharmed yet marked by the blood and chaos around them. It was a terrifying reminder that the crown he had worn since birth also painted a permanent target on his back. That attempt was not an isolated event. Throughout his reign, Alfonso XIII faced repeated threats and attempts on his life, living under the constant awareness that there were those who wished him dead. It takes a particular kind of nerve to carry on with the duties of kingship under such persistent menace, and he did carry on holding to his throne through danger and turmoil year after year. But the perils he faced personally were mirrored by the perils facing the monarchy itself, as the world around him shifted in ways that grew increasingly hostile to the institution he embodied. For the tides of history were turning against kings and crowns across the continent, and Spain was no exception. Beneath the surface, Republican sentiment was rising, political instability was deepening, and the foundations of the monarchy were beginning to crack. Alfonso clung on through mounting difficulties, but the pressures were accumulating toward a breaking point. The dynasty that had ruled on and off through 3 tumultuous centuries was approaching one of its darkest moments, a departure that would leave Spain without a Bourbon on the throne for a very long time, and the manner of that departure would reflect in its own way a flicker of the dignity the family had so often lacked. In 1931, with Republican sentiment sweeping the country and his own position collapsing, Alfonso XIII chose to leave Spain rather than plunge it into bloodshed on his behalf. He departed into exile, and the Second Spanish Republic was declared. For the first time in a very long time, there was no Bourbon on the Spanish throne, and it would stay that way for decades, through Republic, through civil war, and through a long dictatorship that followed. It seemed, for a while, that the strange saga of the Spanish Bourbons had simply ended, fading quietly into exile and history. But dynasties like this one have a way of refusing to disappear, and the most dramatic comeback of the entire family was still waiting in the wings. The circumstances of his departure were, in their way, more graceful than much of what had come before. When elections revealed the depth of Republican feeling and made clear that his position had become untenable, Alfonso faced a choice between clinging to power at the risk of violence or stepping aside to spare his country a bloody struggle on his account. He chose to leave. Rather than provoke a conflict that might tear Spain apart, he departed into exile, allowing the transition to happen without a fight over his crown. After a family history so often marked by treachery and self-interest, there was something almost dignified in a king who declined to make his people bleed for him. With his exit, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed, and the throne stood empty. For the first time in generations, Spain would be governed without a Bourbon at its head, the long, tangled thread of the dynasty seemingly cut at last. The monarchy that had endured madness, scandal, revolution and restoration was set aside, and the country embarked on a new chapter that had no place for a king. To many observers, it may well have looked like the definitive end of the story, the final fading out of a dynasty that had generated more than its share of drama. But the years that followed were anything but peaceful, and they unfolded without the family that had dominated Spanish history for so long. The Republic gave way in time to a savage civil war, and that conflict was followed by a long dictatorship that held power for decades. Throughout this extended period, the Bourbons remained on the outside, living in exile, while their homeland passed through some of the most turbulent and painful chapters of its entire history. The throne sat vacant of their line, and generations grew up in a Spain that had no reigning monarch at all. It would have been easy, during those long years of absence, to assume that the Bourbons were finished, consigned permanently to the history books as a colourful but concluded episode. Exile has a way of turning royal families into faded curiosities, relics of a vanished age with no path back to relevance. The dynasty seemed to have run its course, its members scattered abroad, its throne occupied by no one, its future apparently closed. The strange 300-year saga looked, for all the world, to have reached its final page. Yet the story was not over, because this particular family had an almost supernatural talent for returning from the dead. Just when it seemed the Bourbons had faded permanently into exile, circumstances would align to bring them back once more in what would prove the most surprising and consequential comeback in the whole long chronicle. The restoration to come would place a Bourbon at the very centre of one of the most dramatic moments in modern Spanish history, a moment of genuine heroism followed, with grim inevitability, by the sort of scandal the family had always specialised in. The dynasty was down, but it was very far from out. The monarchy returned in 1975 with Juan Carlos, a grandson of Alfonso XIII, who took the throne as Spain emerged from dictatorship. To the surprise of many, he helped guide the country toward democracy, and in 1981 he famously went on television to face down an attempted military coup, an act that made him a national hero. For a time, he seemed to have finally broken the family curse of chaos and scandal, and then, true to Bourbon tradition, it caught up with him. A lavish elephant hunting trip during a national economic crisis, followed by mounting financial controversies, badly damaged his reputation. He eventually stepped down in favour of his son, and later left Spain to live abroad amid ongoing scrutiny. 300 years after a homesick French teenager first took the throne, the family was still, somehow, generating headlines. Because if the Spanish Bourbons proved anything, it is that a crown can survive almost anything, including the people wearing it. His return to the throne came at a pivotal moment, as Spain stood at the threshold of a new era after decades of dictatorship. Many expected him to simply continue the authoritarian arrangements that had brought him to power, to be a safe pair of hands for the existing order. Instead, he confounded those expectations. Rather than clinging to the old system, he helped steer the country toward democracy, playing a crucial role in the delicate and dangerous transition from dictatorship to a modern constitutional state. It was an unexpected and genuinely constructive act, the sort of far-sighted leadership the family had rarely displayed. His finest hour came when the fragile young democracy was threatened by force. During an attempted military coup, when armed men seized control and the future of Spanish freedom hung in the balance, he intervened decisively. Appearing on television, he made clear that he stood against the plotters and in defence of the constitutional order, using the full weight of his authority to help ensure the coup collapsed. It was a moment of real courage and consequence, and it cemented his reputation as a defender of democracy and a national hero. For once, a Bourbon had risen to a crisis and emerged genuinely admirable. For a good while, it seemed he might be the one to finally break the long family curse, the reign that would be remembered for competence and integrity rather than madness, scandal, or disaster. He enjoyed widespread popularity and respect, both at home and abroad, presiding over a stable and increasingly prosperous democratic Spain. After 3 centuries of dysfunction, it looked as though the dynasty had at last produced a monarch whose legacy would be untainted by the familiar embarrassments. The curse, it appeared, had been broken. But the Bourbons have never been able to leave well enough alone, and in time the old pattern reasserted itself. His reputation, so carefully built, began to unravel amid a series of controversies. A costly hunting expedition undertaken while ordinary Spaniards were suffering through hard economic times struck the public as tone-deaf and self-indulgent, and it was followed by mounting questions about financial affairs that further eroded the respect he'd accumulated. The hero of the democratic transition found his standing crumbling, brought low not by revolution or war but by scandal, that most reliably Bourbon of downfalls. In the end he stepped aside, handing the crown to his son in the hope of preserving the monarchy's standing, and later departed to live abroad amid continuing scrutiny of his conduct. It was a quietly deflating conclusion to a reign that had once soared so high, the familiar family script playing out one more time. 300 years after a homesick French teenager was shipped south to rule a country he had never seen, his distant descendants were still on the throne, still capable of both surprising greatness and spectacular embarrassment, still generating gossip and headlines. The crown had passed through depression and grief, madness and murder, revolution and restoration, and somehow it endured. Which, when you think about it, is the most remarkable part of the whole strange story. So there you have it, 300 years of one family clinging to a throne through just about every kind of trouble a dynasty can invent. Tonight you woke in the court of a homesick French teenager and stayed until his distant descendants were still making headlines, and somewhere in between you met a king soothed to sleep by a single voice, a queen who ran an empire while her husband mended clocks, and a saviour who turned out to be the greatest disappointment of them all. It was a lot. It was chaos and grief and grandeur and a truly astonishing number of people who probably should never have been handed a country. But underneath all the scandal and the strangeness, there is something quietly human in it. These were people, after all, some of them fragile, some of them frightened, some of them simply lost, carrying a weight most of us can barely imagine. The king who could not leave his bed was suffering in a way that had no name and no cure in his time. The widower who came undone had loved his wife more than the whole empire around him. Even the worst of them were, in the end, just people, stumbling through impossible lives while the entire world watched and judged. And that is worth remembering as you drift off tonight, warm and safe and answerable to no one. You do not have to hold an empire together. No mob is at your gate, no rival is eyeing your chair, no painter is quietly recording your every flaw. You can simply rest, which is the one luxury nearly every one of these monarchs would have traded their crown to enjoy. So let your eyes close, let the day go, and let history keep its troubles to itself. Sleep well. You have earned it far more